government should get around the table to negotiate, but hasn't said whether he totally backs nurses' strikes or say what he'd pay them. And he joins us now. So you know what I'm going to ask you, don't you? Good morning, first of all. Good morning. So, you know, people are looking to you as potentially, if the polls are to believe, very possibly the next Prime Minister. And on the subject of nurses' strikes, which it provokes all sorts of emotions in people, you haven't said what pay rise you would think is a good one. What is it?
Well, we would, if we were in government, get round the table and negotiate properly, early and in good faith. And that's what happened when Labour was last in power, and we didn't have a national nurses' strike, and we had the highest levels of satisfaction in the NHS. Now, I think the government has mishandled this, because if you remember, back, I think it was 2 or maybe 3 weeks before Christmas, when the first nurses' strike was about to start, the union said to the government, if you come into the room with us and talk about pay, we won't go on strike. The government sat on its hands for, I don't know, 8, 10 weeks before it then got in the room. And that created an atmosphere in which we've now got a real mess. And it's very rare. I mean, what's happened in the nurses' case is really instructive, because actually the union recommended the deal and the nurses themselves rejected it. That tells you just how angry the nurses are, because that's quite unusual. Most people, there's often this narrative that it's the union leaders somehow that are the problem. Actually, the nurses rejected it, and I think that's because the government... I think it's because the government has mishandled the negotiations.
So the government's mishandled the negotiations. There was no nurses' strike when Labour was in power. You would have handled the build-up very differently and tried to prevent strike action being needed. However, if you do go into government, you're going to inherit this position. And I guess in order to get into government, you need people to be clear on what your solution would be in terms of money, because that's a critical one. So I just wondered, are you aware that it looks like you're sitting on the fence when you give those answers? What is the reason why you can't give a figure? Well,
Straightforward. All negotiations are a compromise. Both sides go into the room. Neither side, actually, this is not special to this particular dispute, it's how it works. Both sides go into the room. They're in a different place, because otherwise you wouldn't be having a negotiation like this, and you compromise around the table. So no side goes in, no government, no union goes into those discussions saying, I'll tell you the figure that we will arrive at, because otherwise there's no point in
so you've got a figure in your head.
We would compromise, but we'd go further than that, because I do think it's important to recognise why we're in this position and why nurses are so angry. And that's because we've had failure for 13 years. We've got a cost of living crisis. People are really struggling to make ends meet. And, you know, negotiating the settlement is one thing. But we'll be, unless the government... unless we change the government, we're going to be back in the same situation. We've had 13 years now without any real economic growth. Most people are much worse off now in real terms than they were 13 years ago. And so we've got to solve the underlying problems as well.
So before we move off this point, you do have something in your head, or you would have something on your head. Can nurses at least feel confident that it's higher than the offer on the table now?
Well, we would compromise with them, and so
I'm not sure that's an answer.
Well, it is. I mean,
so it is higher. It is higher.
Look, we talk to the nurses about this. They understand that. They want a discussion to get in the room and discuss where we can compromise on this. But they also need a longer-term answer, which is, what are you going to do about the cost of living crisis? Because this is out of hand now. People can't afford to make ends meet. The government's totally failed on the economy. They made it 10 times worse last year with the kamikaze budget. So people's mortgages still now higher than they were a year ago because the government made a mess of the economy. That is unacceptable. And then to turn around and say, well, we won't negotiate in the way that you want, that's not acceptable.
Can we talk about the small boat migrant crisis? The immigration bill was cleared last night, the final stage of the House of Commons. It now goes to the Lords. And meanwhile, Robert Jenrick, Immigration Minister, and Suella Braverman, Home Secretary, have put out an interesting narrative out there, and they've faced a lot of opposition to it. They've talked about British values. The subject of British values has come up again, and the Home Secretary has said that the British values of a lot of these migrants coming on these small boats are at odds with the UK. And Robert Jenrick has said that the values and lifestyles of people crossing in small boats threaten the UK's social cohesion. You yourself in the past have talked about this thing about British values. I can't quite put my finger on what that means. What are British values according to you?
Well, I think British values are about respect, about dignity, about tolerance. I think whatever the topic is, they're core values, British values. But what I think is so...
But then would you say that people on those boats do have... will be people who have respect and all those values, and people around the world? I mean, is there any country you can think of that perhaps doesn't have those values? Well,
just talking about the people crossing on those boats. Firstly, I don't want anyone to make that crossing. I do think we should stop the boats. I don't want anybody making that terrible crossing. But I do accept and acknowledge that among the people crossing are desperate people who are being exploited by criminal gangs, who are taking their money to get them to make dangerous crossings in circumstances where they shouldn't be doing it. Now, do I think we should stop the boat? Yes, I do. But...
so where would you put those that come, and how many would you send back? Because I think people are pretty clear on Rishi Sunak's policy. Stop the boats, one of his 5 priorities. How many people watching do you think are clear about your plan and the detail of it? Well,
let me set that out as quickly as I can, because I think 2 things are crucial on this. The first is to break the criminal gangs that are running this. And now, I worked before as a politician as Director of Public Prosecutions, Chief Prosecutor for 5 years, and we put in place cross-border teams to break drug smuggling, gun smuggling across borders.
Didn't work, did it?
Oh, it did. No, drugs and guns, very many operations to break that model.
I see, so you do the same thing.
I do the same for those that are running the people smuggling. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is crucially important, because for all of the Home Secretary's discussions about values, etc., the statistics are against her. Of all the people that came by small boat in the last year or so, the percentage of them that have had their applications processed is 1%. I think anybody watching this would say that is shocking. 1% of those are...
So how will you fix that process?
Well, that's a Home Office problem. That's a problem of...
What would you put? More staff in there? Or how would you solve that?
More staff, better staff, motivated staff, but there's no denying the government has broken the asylum model. The Home Secretary gets up and goes on about her values. If she got in the office and drove down those processing claims are far too... She should be in the office explaining why only 1% is processed.
If you're Prime Minister next year, if there's an election next year, you're Prime Minister, we're pretty much probably going to be in the same situation. There's probably going to be at least 100,000 people sit in hotels, probably, or boats, or wherever they're going to put them. What will you do with them immediately? You know, you will have an immediate problem. Yeah. What will you do with those people almost straight away? Because you will inherit a problem if you become Prime Minister.
Yeah. 2 things. Firstly, process the claims.
OK, that will take 6 months, or probably longer.
The government has utterly broken the asylum system. And if they concentrated on fixing it, we'd be making some real progress. So we're going to have to fix that, process the claims. The second thing, really important, return agreements with other countries. Because at the moment, we don't have any meaningful return agreements. So even if the process is closed, because anybody who's here who shouldn't be here should be removed. But at the moment, the government can't remove them because they don't have a returns agreement.
Yeah, but we know about 70 to 80% of them are actually genuine asylum seekers. We're not talking about that many then, are you? You're talking about sort of maybe 10% might be repatriated?
I think most people would say that process the claims as quickly as possible. If someone's a genuine asylum seeker, let's say someone who's arrived here from Afghanistan who helped British troops there and is in real danger, I think the British would say, well, of course there must be a safe place.
Would you consider...
But where you process the claim and they shouldn't be here, they should be removed. So the government isn't processing the claims and it hasn't got a returns agreement. And in order to mask that terrible failure, they say, look over here in another part of the forest and have a discussion about values. I think most people say, let's not have that discussion, get on with the job.
We've been talking about attack ads quite a lot on this programme, and whether it's a good thing. Now, David Blunkett doesn't like it. You have sort of doubled down and said it's a strong way forward. Is there a risk that people that you've often accused the Tory party of being the nasty party, is there a risk that you're painting yourself with the same approach that you've accused them of?
No, there isn't. I think after 13 years of failure, it is quite right for us to point out in stark terms the failure, whether that's the criminal justice system, which is broken, the NHS, which is broken, or the economy, which is broken. There's almost nothing that isn't broken. And I often ask people, you know, after 13 years, do you feel better off now than you did 13 years ago? And the answer is always no. Do you think our health service is better than it was 13 years ago?
But look, you're moving away. You're moving away to something. Let's bring it back to the subject, because we've had people get in touch as well. Steve on email says, I want to vote Labour, but will not because of the attack ads. Why do you stand by the ad regarding the PM about adults convicted of sexual assaults and children not going to prison? You know, I think people saw you, Mr. Starmer, as probably being the antidote to the politicians we've had in the past. Maybe a little bit normal, maybe a little bit boring, maybe he's not, no, look, maybe they did, or, you know, well, maybe that's what we need. I'm going to be honest.
I need to interrupt you.
This is what people thought. This is what people have thought, and maybe that's a good thing. You know, no big personalities. But here we are, you are sort of becoming like the rest of them, what people will now say, that actually these attack ads are putting you in that camp where actually you're no different to what we've had before.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with, and I support a brutal attack on the government's record. On criminal justice, they've broken the system. When I first heard this statistic, I couldn't believe it, which is that of all the people that come forward to report rape, only 1.6% have their...
So you think the facts
just hear me out, because so for every 100 reported rapes, only 1.6 are making it to our courts. That's terrible. That is real. We shouldn't just say, oh, well, we better not say too much. But we should have the gloves off about that.
It's the same thing like we said to Wes Streeting last week. You know, the Tories could put out a poster saying Keir Starmer cares more about bashing Rishi Sunak than he does about nurses. Would you accept that?
Look, they put out a lot worse than that about me every day. I'm not complaining about it, by the way.
They've never said you might be boring, though, like Adil did they?
Well,
that was an attack.
I'm not putting the poster together.
That was an attack.
I'm saying what people have said. Or I've heard them say on phone-ins and talk.
I know. As a kid, can I talk to you about Diane Abbott, somebody who's spoken on this programme about the terrible, and to us, about the terrible racist abuse she's suffered in the past and the things that she's been through. Because of that, we know she's under investigation and suspended from the party. Because of what she's been through, would it be right to forgive her, whereas you might not have done others in the past, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn?
Yeah. First, let me acknowledge what Diane Abbott has had to put up with for many, many years, because I think she probably suffered more abuse, obviously racial abuse, than any other person in public life, certainly any other politician. And that is terrible, and it should be condemned and called out. And she should be supported in that. But alongside that, or, you know, despite that, what she said in a letter on Sunday is to be condemned. It is suggesting a sort of hierarchy of racism, which I do not accept. And the first thing I said when I became Labour leader, my very first speech, my acceptance speech, was that I would tear anti-Semitism out of the Labour Party by its roots. We've been hard at that for 3 years. We've changed the Labour Party.
Or not?
Well, there's an investigation going on now, but I mean, I'm not going to accept that there's a hierarchy there. We need to look at what she said and come to a decision on that. But what
you already sounded like a government minister. You're saying you're waiting for the results of the investigation. That sounds like the government to have, or do you have a gut feeling?
Well, look, my gut feeling is it's shocking. My gut feeling is that it's anti-Semitic, and that I'm determined to change the Labour Party so that the Labour Party and anti-Semitism are not mentioned in the same sentence. We've done a huge amount of work on that, and I was really pleased that, you know, many in the Jewish community feel much more confident in the Labour Party than they did. But this battle against anti-Semitism is never over.
Do you forgive her because it's something so personal to you? Do you forgive her for it?
Well, look, it's not really for me to say whether I forgive her or not. We've got to have a process to look into what she said. She needs to be able to say in response to that, what her justification is, the circumstance in which it came about. So that process needs to go through. But look, have I been tough on anti-Semitism? Yes, I have. Am I going to continue to be? Yes, I am.